March 7th, 1945. First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann crouched behind a stone wall on the western bank of the Rhine, staring at something that shouldn't exist. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen stretched across the river intact, its steel arches still standing despite the explosions that had just ripped through the morning air. Smoke drifted across the water. German engineers ran in confusion on the far side. Timmermann's radio crackled with his battalion commander's voice, urgent and disbelieving. "Do you see what I see?" Timmermann pressed himself lower as machine gun fire stitched the wall above his head. He'd been fighting across Europe for 2 years, from Normandy through the Ardennes, and he'd never expected to see this. Every bridge across the Rhine had been demolished by retreating German forces. Every single one. The river was supposed to be Germany's last great defensive barrier, a moat protecting the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Hitler had ordered all bridges destroyed rather than let them fall into Allied hands. But here, through smoke and chaos, one bridge still stood. "I see it," Timmermann said into his radio, "and we're taking it." The Rhine stretched nearly 400 meters wide at this point, dark water moving fast with spring melt. On the eastern bank, the Erpelaer cliff rose steeply, honeycombed with defensive positions. German troops scrambled to set up machine guns. More explosions boomed across the bridge as German engineers frantically tried to finish what their first demolition charges had failed to accomplish. The steel deck buckled but held. Timmermann looked at the 23 men of his platoon. They looked back at him, faces pale. Everyone knew what crossing that bridge meant. They'd be completely exposed, German guns firing from both sides of the river, from the cliff face, from the bridge towers. If the Germans got the demolitions working, they'd all die in the middle of the river, but if they didn't cross now, this chance would vanish. "Let's go," Timmermann said, and started running. 300 kilometers away in Berlin, Adolf Hitler sat in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, studying maps that showed a reality he refused to accept. The Western Front had collapsed. American and British forces had reached the Rhine along most of its length. The Ruhr industrial region, the beating heart of German war production, lay exposed. Soviet armies pressed from the east. Germany was being crushed between 2 massive forces. But Hitler had convinced himself the Rhine would stop the Western Allies. The river was wide, fast, and every bridge had been prepared for demolition. His orders had been explicit: destroy all crossings, force the Allies to conduct massive assault crossings that would take weeks to prepare, buy time for his phantom armies to counterattack, for his miracle weapons to turn the tide, for the impossible alliance between the Soviets and Western powers to fracture. He'd built his entire defensive strategy around the Rhine barrier. At Remagen, Timmermann's boots hammered against the bridge deck. Bullets sparked off steel. One of his sergeants fell, then scrambled up and kept running. The bridge swayed under their feet. Wooden planking had been laid over the railroad tracks, and some of it was missing, blown away by the German demolition attempts. They leapt over gaps, sprinted past unexploded charges dangling from cables. Halfway across, Timmermann saw German engineers working frantically at a junction box, trying to detonate the remaining explosives. He fired his carbine. The engineers scattered. Behind him, more American soldiers poured onto the bridge, a flood of infantry racing against time and German firepower. The eastern tower loomed ahead. Machine gun fire raked the bridge from positions in the cliff face. Men fell, others dragged them forward. The bridge deck was slick with blood and oil. Another explosion rocked the structure, this one smaller, a desperate German attempt that only damaged the approach ramp. Then Timmermann's boots hit the eastern bank, German soil. He dove into a crater, his men piling in around him. They'd made it across. The first American soldiers on the eastern side of the Rhine. Within an hour, 300 men had crossed. Within 6 hours, over 8,000. Engineers raced to cut the remaining demolition charges, to shore up the damaged sections, to get vehicles across. The Ludendorff Bridge groaned under the weight, but held. American forces began expanding the bridgehead, pushing inland, securing the heights. The news traveled up the chain of command with electric speed. By mid-afternoon, it reached Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. General Eisenhower, who'd been planning for massive assault crossings that would take weeks and cost thousands of casualties, suddenly had an intact bridge and a growing bridgehead on the wrong side of Germany's last great barrier. "Hot damn," he said when he heard. He immediately ordered every available unit to exploit the breakthrough. Get across the Rhine. Expand the bridgehead. Don't stop. The news reached Berlin that evening. Hitler was in conference with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief West, discussing defensive plans that assumed the Rhine barrier would hold for weeks. An aide entered, pale, carrying an urgent message from Army Group B headquarters. Hitler read it. His hands began to shake, the tremor that had grown worse over the past year becoming more pronounced. His face flushed red. The officers in the room watched as he read the message again, as if repetition might change the words. "This is impossible," Hitler said, his voice tight. "Every bridge was ordered destroyed. Every bridge." Kesselring stepped forward carefully. "Mein Führer, the report states that the demolition charges at Remagen failed to—" "Failed?" Hitler's voice rose to a shout. "Failed? This is sabotage. Treason." He slammed his hand on the table, making the maps jump. "Who was responsible for that bridge? Who commanded the engineers? I want names." The aide consulted his notes, his voice shaking. Captain Willy Bratje commanded the bridge security. Captain Karl Friesenhahn was the engineer officer responsible for demolition. "Arrest them," Hitler said immediately. "Court-martial. I want them shot." "Mein Führer," Kesselring said carefully. "The officers may have done everything possible under difficult—" "Everything possible?" Hitler whirled on him. "The Americans are across the Rhine. Do you understand what this means? They're on German soil. They have a bridgehead. They'll pour forces across that bridge and drive straight into the Ruhr." His voice had become hoarse, almost screaming. "This is the worst military disaster since Stalingrad." The comparison was telling. Stalingrad, where an entire German army had been destroyed, where the tide of the Eastern Front had turned. Hitler saw the Rhine Crossing in the same catastrophic terms. But where Stalingrad had been the result of strategic overreach and Soviet counter-offensive, Remagen was simply the collapse of a defensive line that could no longer be held by exhausted, outnumbered defenders. Hitler paced the bunker, his movements jerky. "Order immediate counterattacks. Every available unit is to move on Remagen. Destroy that bridgehead. Throw them back across the river." Kesselring glanced at the maps. "Mein Führer, we have very limited reserves. Most units are already engaged along the entire front. To concentrate forces at Remagen would mean weakening other sectors." "I don't care about other sectors," Hitler shouted. "That bridge is the priority. Use the 11th Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr, everything." He was naming units that existed mostly on paper now, divisions that had been ground down to fragments in the Ardennes offensive, that lacked fuel, ammunition, replacements. "Mein Führer, those units are not at full strength. Then find other units. Use the Luftwaffe. Bomb that bridge. I want it destroyed, do you understand? Destroyed." Over the following days, Hitler's orders became increasingly frantic and divorced from reality. He demanded counterattacks by divisions that didn't exist. He ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the Remagen Bridge, despite the fact that the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow force, barely capable of putting planes in the air against overwhelming Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe tried. On March 8th, German jets screamed over Remagen in one of the few offensive air operations they could still mount. American anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with flak. Some bombs hit near the bridge. None destroyed it. The jets disappeared as quickly as they'd come, fuel reserves too precious for sustained operations. Hitler called for V-2 rocket strikes against the bridge. The rockets, his vaunted miracle weapons, were redirected from targets in Britain and Belgium. 11 rockets were fired at Remagen. None hit the bridge. The V-2's guidance system wasn't accurate enough to target something as small as a bridge. The rockets fell in the town, in the river, in the surrounding fields. German civilians died in the strikes. The bridge stood. In the bunker, Hitler raged at each failed attempt. He called his Air Force commanders. "Why is that bridge still standing?" he demanded of General der Flieger Rudolf Meister. "I ordered it destroyed." Meister tried to explain the realities of air operations against concentrated anti-aircraft defenses, the shortage of fuel, the loss of experienced pilots. Hitler didn't want to hear it. "Excuses! I want results, not excuses." He turned his fury on the army officers. Major Hans Scheller, operations officer for the Remagen Bridge Defense, was arrested and brought before a court-martial. So was Captain Bratsch, the bridge commander, Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer officer, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, who'd been in charge of the actual demolition. 4 more officers connected to the bridge defense. The trials were brief. The verdict predetermined. Hitler wanted executions, and Hitler got them. On March 9th, just 2 days after the bridge capture, the court-martial convened in a castle near Remagen, even as fighting raged nearby. The officers were given minimal opportunity to defend themselves. They explained how the demolition charges had been damaged by American artillery, how they'd fought to the last moment to destroy the bridge, how they'd been overwhelmed by the speed of the American assault. None of it mattered. The court found them guilty of failing to destroy the bridge. The sentence was death. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was present in the bunker when the execution orders were confirmed. He later described Hitler's demeanor. He showed no emotion, no regret. These were officers who'd fought throughout the war, who'd done their duty under impossible circumstances, but Hitler saw only that they'd failed him. In his mind, failure was treason. 4 officers were shot: Lieutenant Peters, Major Scheller, and 2 others. Captain Bratke was captured by Americans before his execution could be carried out. Captain Friesenhahn was also captured. They survived the war to testify about those final days, about Hitler's rage, about the impossible situation they'd faced. The executions accomplished nothing. The bridge still stood. The bridgehead continued to expand. By March 10th, over 25,000 American troops had crossed at Remagen. Engineers worked around the clock to build pontoon bridges alongside the damaged Ludendorff Bridge, creating multiple crossing points. Hitler's counterattacks failed before they began. The units he ordered to Remagen were too weak, too scattered, too short of fuel and ammunition. Those that reached the bridgehead were thrown back by American forces that grew, stronger by the hour. The Luftwaffe's attempts to bomb the bridge became increasingly desperate and futile. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. The steel structure, damaged by German demolition attempts, weakened by American engineering work to keep it standing, stressed by the constant flow of heavy vehicles, simply gave way. The center span dropped into the Rhine with a thunderous crash. 28 American engineers working on the bridge died in the collapse, but by then it didn't matter. 5 pontoon bridges already spanned the river at Remagen. The bridgehead extended 15 kilometers deep and 30 kilometers wide. Over 60,000 troops had crossed. The Rhine barrier was broken. Hitler's reaction to the bridge collapse was not relief, but fury that it had taken so long. 10 days, he shouted in the bunker. The bridge stood for 10 days while they poured forces across. Why couldn't it have been destroyed on the first day? No one dared answer that it had been his own defensive strategy that failed, that his refusal to allow strategic withdrawals had left his forces too weak to hold any line, that his insistence on fighting for every meter of ground had exhausted his armies. Instead, Hitler turned to new fantasies. He ordered more counterattacks, using forces that existed only in his imagination. He drew arrows on maps showing German divisions driving the Americans back across the Rhine, encircling them, destroying them. The arrows bore no relationship to the actual positions or capabilities of German forces. Field Marshal Kesselring watched these planning sessions with growing despair. He later wrote, "The Führer lived in a world of his own creation. He would not accept that the war was lost, that the Rhine Crossing was merely the inevitable next step in Germany's defeat. He demanded miracles from armies that had ceased to exist." But Hitler's reaction to Remagen went beyond military delusion. It revealed something darker about his state of mind in those final weeks. The executions of the bridge officers showed a man who had lost all connection to the soldiers fighting under his command, who saw them not as human beings, but as tools that had failed their function. When General Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff, protested the executions, Hitler turned on him. "They failed in their duty," Hitler said coldly. "The penalty for failure is death. That's the only way to maintain discipline." "They were good officers," Guderian argued. "They fought with everything they had. The Americans simply moved too fast. The demolitions were damaged." "Excuses!" Hitler shouted. "I'm surrounded by people making excuses. No one takes responsibility. No one fights hard enough." His face had gone purple. "Perhaps you sympathize with them. Perhaps you also lack the will to fight." Guderian, who'd commanded panzer armies across Europe and Russia, who'd fought through 5 years of war, stood silent. There was no point in arguing. Hitler had moved beyond reason. The Remagen crossing was followed by more crossings. On March 22nd, General George Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. Patton, characteristically, made the crossing look easy, his forces establishing a bridgehead with minimal casualties before the Germans even realized what was happening. When Patton called to report his success, he couldn't resist adding, "and without even the benefit of aerial bombardment, ground smoke, artillery preparation, or airborne assistance." It was a dig at Field Marshal Montgomery, whose massive set-piece crossing was planned for the next day. On March 23rd, Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, a meticulously planned assault crossing involving 2 armies, massive artillery preparation, airborne drops, and overwhelming force. It succeeded, as everyone knew it would. The Germans were too weak to stop it. Hitler's response to these additional crossings was more of the same. Orders for counterattacks that couldn't happen, demands for the destruction of bridges that were too well defended, rage at commanders for failing to achieve the impossible. But something had changed after Remagen. Hitler's fury had a desperate quality now. He seemed to understand, on some level he wouldn't acknowledge, that the Rhine crossings marked the beginning of the end. The last barrier had fallen. American and British forces were pouring into Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr was being encircled. The war was entering its final phase. In the bunker, Hitler's daily military conferences became surreal performances. He would study maps, moving pins representing divisions that had been destroyed weeks ago, planning offensives with armies that existed only in his mind. His staff played along, knowing that contradiction meant dismissal or worse. But occasionally, the mask would slip. Speer recalled one moment in late March when Hitler stared at the map showing Allied forces deep inside Germany and said quietly, "They should never have gotten across the Rhine." It was the closest he came to admitting that Remagen had been a turning point. Then the moment passed, and Hitler was back to his delusions, issuing orders for counterattacks, demanding that his forces fight to the last man, the last bullet, refusing to consider anything but total victory or total destruction. The officers executed for the loss of Remagen Bridge had been dead for weeks by then, shot for the crime of being unable to stop the inevitable. Their deaths accomplished nothing except to show Hitler's complete disconnection from reality, his willingness to destroy his own people rather than face the truth of Germany's defeat. Lieutenant Timmerman, who'd led the charge across the Ludendorff Bridge, survived the war, but died in 1951 at age 37 from injuries sustained during the bridge collapse. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Remagen. In his later interviews, he rarely spoke about the crossing itself, preferring to remember the men who'd run across the bridge with him, some of whom hadn't made it to the other side. The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt. Its towers still stand on both banks of the Rhine, now housing a museum about the crossing. The bridge's capture is remembered as one of the most significant tactical victories of the Western Front, a moment when luck and courage combined to shorten the war by weeks, perhaps months. Hitler's reaction to that moment, the executions, the impossible orders, the rage at reality itself, revealed a man who had lost not just the war, but his grip on sanity. In ordering good officers shot for failing to achieve the impossible, in demanding counterattacks with armies that didn't exist, in refusing to accept that the Rhine barrier had fallen, Hitler showed that he was no longer a military leader, but a man trapped in delusion. The Rhine crossings continued through late March. By early April, American forces had encircled the Ruhr, trapping over 300,000 German troops. The industrial heart of Germany had fallen. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. The war had perhaps a month left to run. In the bunker, Hitler still studied his maps, still issued orders, still raged at the failures of his commanders. But the officers around him knew the truth. Remagen had been the moment when Germany's last defensive barrier fell, when the war's outcome became not just inevitable, but imminent. The bridge that shouldn't have been standing, captured by a lieutenant and 23 men in a desperate sprint across the Rhine, had broken more than a defensive line. It had broken Hitler's last strategic hope, forcing him to confront a reality he could only answer with rage, with executions, with orders that bore no relationship to the possible. What Hitler said when the Allies crossed the Rhine in 24 hours was revealing. Not a military assessment of the situation, not a strategic adjustment to the new reality, but accusations of treason, demands for executions, orders for counterattacks that couldn't happen. His words showed a man who had ceased to be a military commander and had become something else entirely. A figure trapped in his own mythology, unable to see the world as it was, capable only of lashing out at those around him for failing to make his fantasies real. The Rhine had been crossed. The war was lost, and Hitler, in his bunker beneath Berlin, could only rage at the inevitable.